Welcome to goldenageradio.com, rumble.com/C/GAR. Brand new episodes every week. Visit veteransradioministry.com to listen to more episodes like this.
The lieutenant stood in front of the steel sphere and gnawed a piece of pine splinter. "What do you think of it, Stevens?" he said. "It's an idea," said Stevens. "I believe it'll smash flat," said the lieutenant. "He seems to have calculated it all out pretty well," said Stevens. "But think of the pressure," said the lieutenant. "At the surface of the water, it's 14 pounds to the inch. 30 feet down, it's double that. 60, treble. At a mile, it's 30 hundredweight, a ton and a half, Stevens. A ton and a half to the square inch, and the ocean where he's going is 5 miles deep." "Sounds a lot," said Stevens, "but it's jolly thick steel." The lieutenant made no answer, but resumed his pine splinter. The object of their conversation was a huge ball of steel, having an exterior diameter of perhaps 9 feet. It looked like the shot for some titanic piece of artillery. It was elaborately nested in a monstrous scaffolding built into the framework of the vessel, and the gigantic spars that were presently to sling it overboard gave the stern of the ship an appearance that had raised the curiosity of every decent sailor who had sighted it from the Pool of London to the Tropic of Capricorn. In 2 places, one above the other, the steel gave place to a couple of circular windows of enormously thick glass, and one of these, set in a steel frame of great solidity, was now partially unscrewed. Both the men had seen the interior of this globe for the first time that morning. It was elaborately padded with air cushions, with little studs sunk between bulging pillows to work the simple mechanism of the affair. Everything was elaborately padded, even the Myers apparatus, which was to absorb carbonic acid and replace the oxygen inspired by its tenant, when he had crept in by the glass manhole and had been screwed in. It was so elaborately padded that a man might have been fired from a gun in it with perfect safety. And it had need to be, for presently a man was to crawl in through the glass manhole, to be screwed up tightly, and to be flung overboard, and to sink down, down, down for 5 miles, even as the lieutenant said. "It's my opinion," said the lieutenant, "that that glass will simply bend in and smash under a pressure of that sort." "If the glass did break in," said Stevens, "what then?" "The water would shoot in like a jet of iron. Have you ever felt a straight jet of high-pressure water? It would hit as hard as a bullet. It would simply smash him." "And the globe?" "Would just give out a few little bubbles, and it would settle down comfortably against the Day of Judgment, among the oozes and the bottom clay, with poor Elstead spread over his own smashed cushions like butter over bread." "Having a look at the jigger?" said a voice, and Elstead stood between them, spick and span in white. "What's that about bread and butter, Weybridge? Grumbling as usual about the insufficient pay of naval officers? It won't be more than a day now before I start. We are to get the slings ready today. This clean sky and gentle swell is just the kind of thing for swinging off a dozen tons of lead and iron, isn't it?" "It won't affect you much," said Weybridge. "No. 70 or 80 feet down, and I shall be there in a dozen seconds. There's not a particle moving, though the wind shriek itself hoarse up above and the water lift halfway to the clouds. No, down there—" He moved to the side of the ship, and the other 2 followed him. All 3 leant forward on their elbows and stared down into the yellow-green water. "Peace," said Elstead, finishing his thought aloud. "I wouldn't go down in that confounded thing," said Weybridge, "for 20,000 pounds. "Cheerful chap you are," said Elstead, and spat sociably at a bubble below. "I don't understand yet how you mean to work the thing," said Stevens. "In the first place, I'm screwed into the sphere," said Elstead, "and when I've turned the electric light off and on 3 times to show I'm cheerful, I'm slung out over the stern by that crane, with all those big lead sinkers slung below me. The top lead weight has a roller, carrying 100 fathoms of strong cord rolled up, and that's all that joins the sinkers to the sphere, except the slings that will be cut when the affair is dropped. Through each of these lead weights you notice there's a hole, and an iron rod will be run through that and will project 6 feet on the lower side. If that rod is rammed up from below, it knocks up a lever and sets the clockwork in motion at the side of the cylinder on which the cord winds. "But why the cord?" asked Stevens. "Why not fasten the weights directly to the sphere?" "Because of the smash down below. The whole affair will go rushing down mile after mile at a headlong pace at last. It had been knocked to pieces at the bottom if it wasn't for that cord. But the weights will hit the bottom, and directly they do, the buoyancy of the sphere will come into play. It'll go on sinking, slower and slower, come to a stop at last, and then begin to float upward again. That's where the clockwork comes in. Directly the weights smash against the sea bottom, the rod will be knocked through, and will kick up the clockwork, and the cord will be rewound on the reel. I shall be lugged down to the sea bottom, and there I shall stay for half an hour, with the electric lights on, looking about me. Then the clockwork will release a spring knife. The cord will be cut, and up I shall rush again like a soda water bubble. The cord itself will help the flotation." "And if you should chance to hit a ship," said Weybridge. "I should come up at such a pace I should go clean through it," said Elstead. "Ha! Like a cannonball. You needn't worry about that." They had swung Elstead overboard by 11 o'clock. The day was serenely bright and calm, with the horizon lost in haze. The electric glare in the little upper compartment beamed cheerfully 3 times. Then they let him down slowly to the surface of the water, and a sailor in the stern chains hung ready to cut the tackle that held the lead weights and the sphere together. The globe, which had looked so large on deck, looked the smallest thing conceivable under the stern of the ship. It rolled a little, and its 2 dark windows, which floated uppermost, seemed like eyes turned up in round wonderment at the people who crowded the rail. A voice wondered how Elstead liked the rolling. "Are you ready?" called the commander. "Aye, aye, sir." "Then let it go." The rope of the tackle tightened against the blade and was cut, and an eddy rolled over the globe in a grotesquely helpless fashion. It seemed to be stationary for a moment, to grow rapidly smaller, and then the water closed over it, and it became visible, enlarged by refraction and dimmer, below the surface. Before one could count 3, it had disappeared. There was a flicker of white light far down in the water that diminished to a speck and vanished. Then there was nothing but a depth of water going down into blackness, through which a shark was swimming. Then suddenly the screw of the cruiser began to rotate. The water was crickled, the shark disappeared in a wrinkled confusion, and a torrent of foam rushed across the crystalline clearness that had swallowed up Elstead. "What's the idea?" said one A.B. to another. "We're going to lay off a couple of miles, fear he should hit us when he comes up." The ship steamed slowly to her new position. Aboard her, almost everyone who was unoccupied remained watching the breathing swell into which the sphere had sunk. The December sun was now high in the sky, and the heat very considerable. "He'll be cold enough down there," said Weybridge. "They say that below a certain depth, sea water is always just about freezing." "Where'll he come up?" said Stevens. "I've lost my bearings." "That's the spot," said the commander, who prided himself on his omniscience. He extended a precise finger southeastward. "And this, I reckon, is pretty nearly the moment," he said. "He's been 35 minutes. "How long does it take to reach the bottom of the ocean?" said Stevens. "For a depth of 5 miles, and reckoning as we did an acceleration of 2 feet per second, both ways, just about 3/4 of a minute." "Then he's overdue," said Weybridge. "Pretty nearly," said the commander. "I suppose it takes a few minutes for that cord of his to wind in." "Oh, I forgot that," said Weybridge. And then began the suspense. A minute slowly dragged itself out, and no sphere shot out of the water. Another followed, and nothing broke the low, oily swell. The sailors explained to one another that little point about the winding in of the cord. The rigging was dotted with expectant faces. "Come up, Elstead," called one hairy-chested salt, and the others caught it up and shouted as though they were waiting for the curtain of a theatre to rise. The commander glanced irritably at them. "Of course, if the acceleration is less than 2, he said, "he'll be all the longer. We aren't absolutely certain that was the proper figure. I'm no slavish believer in calculations." Stevens agreed concisely. No one on the quarterdeck spoke for a couple of minutes. Then Stevens' watch case clicked. When, 21 minutes after the sun reached the zenith, They were still waiting for the globe to reappear. Not a man aboard had dared to whisper that hope was dead. It was Weybridge who did so first. "I always distrusted that window," he said quite suddenly to Stevens. "Good grief," said Stevens. "You don't think—" "Well," said Weybridge, and left the rest to his imagination. "I'm no great believer in calculations myself," said the commander, "so I'm not altogether without hope yet." And at midnight, the gunboat was steaming in a spiral round the spot where the globe had sunk, and the white beam of the electric light fled and halted and swept discontentedly onward again over the waste of phosphorescent waters under the little stars. "If his window hasn't burst and smashed him," said Weybridge, "then it's a cursed sight worse, for his clockwork's gone wrong, and he's alive now, 5 miles under our feet, down there in the cold and dark, anchored in that little bubble of his, where never a ray of light has shone or a human being lived since the waters were gathered together. He's there without food, feeling hungry and thirsty and scared, wondering whether he'll starve or stifle. Which will it be?" Suddenly he stopped, turned, called, "Elstead, ahoy!" and went at a run to Lindley and the searchlight. "I saw him," he said. "Starboard there. His light's on and he's just shot out of the water. Bring the light round. We ought to see him drifting when he lifts on the swell." But they could not pick up the explorer until dawn. Then they almost ran him down. The crane was swung out, and a boat's crew hooked the chain to the sphere. When they had shipped the sphere, they unscrewed the manhole. There was no answer to their eager questions, and no sound of movement within. Elstead seemed to be lying motionless, crumpled up in the bottom of the globe. The ship's doctor crawled in and lifted him out to the men outside. He was not dead, they found, but in a state of absolute nervous collapse, and besides cruelly bruised. For some days he had to lie perfectly still. It was a week before he could tell his experiences. Almost his first words were that he was going down again. The sphere would have to be altered, he said, in order to allow him to throw off the cord if need be, and that was all. He had had the most marvellous experience. "You thought I should find nothing but ooze," he said. "You laughed at my explorations, and I've discovered a new world." He told his story in disconnected fragments, and chiefly from the wrong end, so that it is impossible to retell it in his words, but what follows is the narrative of his experience. "It began atrociously," he said. "Before the cord ran out, the thing kept rolling over. He felt like a frog in a football. Suddenly the swaying ceased, the globe righted, and when he had picked himself up, he saw the water all about him greeny-blue, with an attenuated light filtering down from above, and a shoal of little floating things went rushing up past him, as it seemed to him, towards the light. And even as he looked, it grew darker and darker, until the water above was as dark as the midnight sky. In 50 seconds, everything was as black as night outside, except where the beam from his light struck through the waters and picked out every now and then some fish or scrap of sinking matter. They flashed by too fast for him to see what they were. Once he thinks he passed a shark. And then the sphere began to get hot by friction against the water. They had underestimated this, it seems. Then suddenly the floor of the sphere seemed to press against his feet. The window had not cracked, nothing had given, and he knew that the dangers of sinking, at any rate, were over. In another minute or so, he would be on the floor of the abyss. He thought, he said, of Stevens and Weybridge, and the rest of them 5 miles overhead, higher to him than the very highest clouds that ever floated over land are to us, steaming slowly, and staring down and wondering what had happened to him. He peered out of the window. Outside there was a heavy blackness, as black velvet, except where the electric light pierced the empty water and showed the colour of it, a yellow-green. As he went on down, he noticed that the water became of a pallid colour, probably due to the clouds of ooze and mud that the impact of his leaden sinkers had disturbed. By the time he was drawn down to the lead weights, he was in a dense fog of white that his electric light failed altogether to pierce for more than a few yards, and many minutes elapsed before the hanging sheets of sediment subsided to any extent. Then, lit by his light and by the transient phosphorescence of a distant shoal of fishes, he was able to see, under the huge blackness of the superincumbent water, an undulating expanse of greyish-white ooze, broken here and there by tangled thickets of a growth of sea lilies, waving hungry tentacles in the air. Then suddenly the hovering swarm of little fishes veered about and came towards him, as a flight of starlings might do. They passed over him like a phosphorescent snow, and then he saw behind them some larger creature advancing towards the sphere. At first he could see it only dimly, a faintly moving figure, remotely suggestive of a walking man. And then it came into the spray of light that the lamp shot out. As the glare struck it, it shut its eyes, dazzled. He stared in rigid astonishment. It was a strange, vertebrated animal. Its dark purple head was dimly suggestive of a chameleon, but it had such a high forehead and such a brain case as no reptile ever displayed before. The vertical pitch of its face gave it a most extraordinary resemblance to a human being. Two large and protruding eyes projected from sockets in chameleon fashion, and it had a broad reptilian mouth with horny lips beneath its little nostrils. In the position of the ears were two huge gill covers. But the humanity of the face was not the most extraordinary thing about the creature. It was a biped. Its almost globular body was poised on a tripod of two frog-like legs and a long, thick tail, and its forelimbs, which grotesquely caricatured the human hand, much as a frog's do, carried a long shaft of bone tipped with copper. The colour of the creature was variegated. Its head, hands, and legs were purple, but its skin, which hung loosely upon it, even as clothes might do, was a phosphorescent grey. And it stood there, blinded by the light. At last, this unknown creature of the abyss blinked its eyes open, and shading them with its disengaged hand, opened its mouth and gave vent to a shouting noise, articulate almost as speech might be, that penetrated even the steel case and padded jacket of the sphere. In another moment, something soft dabbed upon the steel, and the globe swayed. Then the shouting was repeated, and it seemed to him that a distant echo answered it. The dabbing recurred, and the whole globe swayed and ground against the spindle over which the wire was rolled. He stood in the blackness and peered out into the everlasting night of the abyss, and presently he saw, very faint and remote, other phosphorescent quasi-human forms hurrying towards him. The sphere twisted and then threw him down. He heard shouts like shouts of surprise, and when he rose to his feet, he saw two pairs of stalked eyes peering into the lower window and reflecting his light. In another moment, hands were dabbing vigorously at his steel casing, and there was a sound, horrible enough in his position, of the metal protection of the clockwork being vigorously hammered. That, indeed, sent his heart into his mouth, for if these strange creatures succeeded in stopping that, his release would never occur. Scarcely had he thought as much when he felt the sphere spinning slowly and rocking, and it seemed to him that it was also being drawn through the water. By crouching close to the window, he saw, faint and remote across the undulations of the submarine plain, a broad horizon of pale luminosity that extended this way and that way as far as the range of his little window permitted him to see. To this he was being towed at the end of his cord, as a balloon might be towed by men out of the open country into a town. He approached it very slowly, and very slowly the dim irradiation was gathered together into more definite shapes. It was nearly 5 o'clock before he came over this luminous area, and by that time he could make out an arrangement suggestive of streets and houses, grouped about a vast, roofless erection that was grotesquely suggestive of a ruined abbey. It was spread out like a map below him. The houses were all roofless enclosures of walls, and their substance being, as he afterwards saw, of phosphorescent bones, gave the place an appearance as if it were built of drowned moonshine. In the open spaces of the place he could see a stirring movement, as of crowds of people, but he was too many fathoms above them to distinguish the individuals in those crowds. Then slowly they pulled him down, and as they did so, he perceived that at several points below him, in broad open spaces, were forms like the encrusted shapes of ships. Slowly and surely he was drawn down, and the forms below him became brighter, clearer, more distinct. He was being pulled down, he perceived, towards the large building in the centre of the town. And then the walls of the great building rose about him silently and hid the city from his eyes. And such walls they were, of waterlogged wood and twisted wire rope, and iron spars and copper, and the bones and skulls of dead men. The skulls ran in zigzag lines and spirals and fantastic curves over the buildings, and in and out of their eye sockets, and over the whole surface of the place, lurked and played a multitude of silvery little fishes. Suddenly his ears were filled with a low shouting and a noise like the violent blowing of horns, and this gave place to a fantastic chant. Down the sphere sank, and at last he came to rest, as it seemed, on a kind of altar that stood in the centre of the place. And now he was at such a level that he could see these strange people of the abyss plainly once more. To his astonishment, he perceived that they were prostrating themselves before him, all save one, dressed as it seemed in a robe of placoid scales, and crowned with a luminous diadem, who stood with his reptilian mouth opening and shutting, as though he led the chanting of the worshippers. And thus they continued worshipping him, without rest or intermission, for a space of 3 hours. Most circumstantial was Elsted's account of his astounding city and its people, these people of perpetual night who have never seen sun or moon or stars, green vegetation, nor any living, air-breathing creatures. Startling as is his story, it is yet more startling to find that certain scientific men of eminence find nothing incredible in it. They tell me they see no reason why intelligent, water-breathing, vertebrated creatures inured to a low temperature and enormous pressure might not live upon the bottom of the deep sea, and quite unsuspected by us. We should be known to them, however, as strange meteoric creatures, wont to fall catastrophically dead out of the mysterious blackness of their watery sky. And not only we ourselves, but our ships, our metals, our appliances, would come raining down out of the night. Sometimes sinking things would smite down and crush them, as if it were the judgment of some unseen power. The manner of his release Elsted does not understand, but to judge by the end of cord that hung from the sphere, it had been cut through by rubbing against the edge of the altar. Abruptly, the sphere rolled over, and he swept up out of their world. He must have torn out of their sight as a hydrogen bubble hastens upward from our air. And that is the substance of the extraordinary story that Elsted related, in fragments, to the officers of the cruiser. He promised to write it all down at a later date. His mind was chiefly occupied with the improvement of his apparatus, which was effected at Rio. It remains only to tell that on February the 2nd, 1896, he made his second descent into the ocean abyss with the improvements his first experience suggested. What happened, we shall never know, for he never returned.
In the Abyss by H.G. Wells was read by Timothy Kitely. It was adapted by Neville Teller, and the producer was Pamela Howe.